This is the third screencast for chapters 5 and 6, and we're going to start off talking about temperatures. So what are some of the characteristics of a particular biome? So and these are somewhat general statements, and you may see something slightly different depending which resource you're looking at, but in general, if you're below 5 degrees Celsius, which is kind of cold, and this is like an average, you're looking at something probably like a tundra or like a boreal forest, a coniferous forest, and these are northern or southern climates, or high in elevation. If you're between 5 and 20 degrees Celsius, you're looking at something more temperate, which is kind of where we live. And if your average temperature is somewhere above 20 degrees Celsius, you're probably in a more tropical location. And those are some guidelines. Now, if you're looking at precipitation, it's not quite as definitive, but generally as the temperature goes up, these are typically going to be more moist, wet locations. But of course, you could be in a desert, so I guess it depends what latitude you're at as well. Okay. Some of the biomes we're going to look at, you can just kind of skip through that. I'm not going to mention every one of these. Climatograms. We're going to do a bunch of those in class. So basically what you're looking at with a climatogram is you're just measuring or writing down or taking a look at, examining the precipitation in comparison to the temperature for any given month. And this is throughout a year. And you can see how it kind of fluctuates or doesn't fluctuate throughout the year. With that information, you could make some inferences in regards to what the growing season might be based on temperature and precipitation, when it's dry, and that's mostly the information you would get out of it. Some things you're not going to get out of these types of displays is you're not going to know what the wind patterns are. It's not necessarily going to tell you what the humidity level is there. You could make some guesses, but that's not the information that they present. Okay. So looking at a few here, deserts. A lot of times we think of deserts, we think of hot, and that's not necessarily the case. So when we're looking at some of these here, we see, okay, well, this is a tropical desert, the one here at the top. And notice we have the freezing, so we got that nice and clear. But look at the temperatures, typically above 20 degrees Celsius. And this one here, it's a desert. They have very little precipitation, and it comes only in the November, December, January range in there. And then you get a temperate desert, which again, the temperatures are still fairly high. Well, it goes as low as 0, and it gets up to maybe 20. So not necessarily high, somewhat moderate. Temperate, hey, look at that. But the precipitation is still rather low. So looking at precipitation, it's still marked over here on the right-hand side, but low. And then freezing, of course, you can see that kind of odd. And it's like, well, it must just because it gets a little bit below there. It happens to be polar, so it's the temperature still does get warm in some locations, but there could be some other influencing factors there in regards to ocean currents and such. So polar based, probably primarily based on its latitude, but based on ocean currents that may have some influencing on the temperature of the location. But then again, it is still dry. Okay. Got it? All right, grassland. What makes a grassland a grassland? Well, pretty easy as far as this little idea. It's too moist to be a desert and too dry to be a forest. Easy enough. So if you take a look at these diagrams here, you notice that the precipitation is markedly higher than it was in a desert. One of the other things you have to notice there is because it's dry, one of the visual characteristics is you don't find a lot of trees in grasslands because when it gets dry, something that usually goes along with that is you have fires. So you never have trees lasting long enough because of the fires to have a forest. So that's one of the scenarios you see. So it's dominated by plants that are usually adapted to frequent fires. And just a couple of notes on that. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. You can just kind of read through these. Some of the different names you might see in there. This one here, chaparral, we have one of those in California, Southern California. Polar grasslands, you have those. I think sometimes they might be called the taiga when you get a little further north. But you can take a look through these. All right, forests. There's a few different types of forests that we'll mention here. The ones we typically like to think of are either going to be a tropical rainforest, and we're kind of familiar with what those are. Usually like in the Amazon, someplace like that, maybe Indonesia. Another one, which is where we live, which would be a temperate deciduous forest. Notice we have our in our location. Again, we could be in the southern hemisphere as well, but we have our summer months where the temperature is high. But notice in this scenario, we don't have a spike, I guess you could say, in precipitation. Usually it's in the spring months and sometimes in the later fall months. And then for a polar evergreen coniferous forest, or sometimes called a boreal forest or a taiga, typically over there you're going to have somewhat of a range. It gets pretty darn cold, think Canada, and then you get kind of a moderate summer. And then the precipitation will model something along that as well. All right, so just breaking it up a little bit. We've mentioned some of these things before. One of the things, I don't know if it says this here or not, but because of the amount of vegetation you have in these locations, you have a very large biodiverse location because of all these individual little niches that you can have. And again, they're typically very warm, typically very moist. But as we mentioned before, the soils themselves are not very rich because most of that organic matter is sitting up in the trees. Temperate deciduous, that's one we're probably most familiar with because we live in one. And taking a look at one of the things it's marked by is the loss of the vegetation in the wintertime. So things like maple trees are not everywhere. They are adapted to be in our type of a location where eventually it gets so cold that the trees just shut down and go into a hibernation, slowing down. It doesn't mean they stop growing. There's still activity below ground, but they don't have anything going on necessarily above ground. And what that does for that particular location is all that organic material falls, decays, and creates a very rich organic soil. Coniferous forests, if you go a little further north, think Russia or Canada, the primary vegetation you're going to have in those locations is going to be like pine trees, coniferous trees that have needles that are very well adapted to the cold, harsh climates that they have in those locations. Temperate rainforests, think Oregon or Washington. Those locations actually have rainforests. So we have rainforests right here in the United States. Think the Pacific Northwest because of the ocean conditions, the mountains. They're typically very wet. So if you think of the redwoods, the giant redwoods out in California, in Oregon, those are part of a temperate rainforest.